Hey everybody, this is your good friend, Gnostic Agnostic, and I would like to talk to you today about homosexuality, and more specifically, the morality of homoeroticism. Now, there are some people in the world today, actually there's quite a few, and there's some people on YouTube who are still laboring under the false notion that there is somehow there's something wrong with homosexuality. I'm here today to lift that burden from your shoulders. There are two main ways that I've encountered people arguing against homosexuality. Those are arguments from religion and arguments from nature. Let's start by debunking arguments against homosexuality from nature. Go! Arguments against homosexuality from nature usually boil down to homosexuality is against nature, and therefore it's immoral. Now, right off the bat, you can identify a false premise. The only premise. Homosexuality is against nature. In the broadest sense, nature is the natural world. All ecosystems put together. So that's nature. Homosexuality has no bearing on nature. Therefore, it can't go against it. Two people having sex in a room does not affect the ecosystem at large, at all. Therefore, homosexuality does not go against nature. It has no effect on nature. One of the most common arguments against homosexuality from nature is that a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, through as much sex as they want to have, can never produce a baby. This seems to me to be completely aside from nature. This has to do with the utility of genitalia. And it seems to be arguing that if something isn't used for its intended, or rather evolved, purpose, then it is immoral. But does this really make sense? I'll just provide a counterexample. Your foot. It obviously didn't evolve to kick a ball. By this logic, by the logic in the argument that a man and a woman can't produce a baby, therefore gay sex is immoral, kicking a soccer ball, which also goes against evolution, or godly intended purposes, would be completely immoral. Obviously, that's not the case, therefore this argument is moot. It's null and void. 7 more counterexamples for why utility shouldn't be the arbiter for morality in the sexual arena. If it was, if the logic that a man and a woman can't have a baby through their sexual activity and therefore their sexual activity is wrong, handjobs, blowjobs, sodomy, any form of non-penetrating sex, sex with postmenopausal women, contracepted sex, and sex with people who were born infertile or became infertile at any point in time would also become immoral. Going back to the idea that homosexuality is against nature and therefore it's immoral, the step from nature to morality can't be made for the simple reason that nature is completely outside of morality. Nature is, in its essence, amoral, and therefore morality cannot be derived from it. Humans do not actually derive their sexual ethics from nature for the simple reason that many of the sexual practices found in nature are completely and utterly immoral. Take the case of the praying mantis. The female mantis, after mating with her mate, will often bite off his head and eat him to have an easier time shelling out the nutrients for laying eggs. Now, post-sexual cannibalism is not endorsed by humanity because it's immoral. This simple counterexample makes the case that humans do not, in fact, derive our sexual ethics from nature. Any arguments against homosexuality from nature presuppose that homosexuality is, in fact, not found in nature, or that animals do not display homosexual tendencies. This is, in fact, not the case. In his book, Biological Exuberance, Animal Homosexuality and Natural Diversity, Bruce Bagemill shows that over 1,500 different species of animal have been shown to display homosexual tendencies. And homosexuality is a well-documented phenomenon in over 500 species. Now, you've got to get an understanding for this. These species range anywhere from primates to like gutworms. Homosexuality is incredibly well documented in birds. So homosexuality is not, in fact, against nature. It's part of nature. It's found in nature. That's it for arguments from nature. On to religion. In the Old Testament, or the Jewish scriptures, especially Leviticus, God seems to have a very clear idea about what he thinks about homosexuality, and he makes those ideas very clear to us. Thou shalt not sleep with mankind as thou wouldst sleep with womankind. Unfortunately, God doesn't make it clear to us why this is true, which just demeans his whole argument to an argument from authority. You shan't do this because God says you shan't. That's not an argument, that's just an assertion. I mean, to believe that, you're going to have to convince anybody who's supposed to follow that rule that there is a God, that he is omnipotent, and that he is the source of morality. You have all your work still ahead of you. After that, it's just this sort of might makes right argument. God says you shan't, and if you do it, it's a sin, and he'll send you to hell forever. So you better not do it. Those are just bully boy tactics. That's not an argument at all. It's just intimidating. The second largest problem with arguing that God doesn't want you to commit homosexual acts is that there are some religions with gods and goddesses, namely paganism and Wicca, that are just fine with homosexuality. So before anybody goes around saying God doesn't want you to commit homosexual acts, they're going to have to discredit Wicca and paganism through discourse and through logic. Of course, Christianity doesn't have much of a history of polite debate and discourse with paganism and Wicca, but I think I'll leave that for another video, huh? This one's a bit of a roundabout. The existence of God cannot be proven. The cleverest theologians in the world have racked their brains for centuries. In fact, the entire religious apologetics industry is based around trying to prove God. But God still hasn't been conclusively proven. The only people who must be wrong in any sort of argument about God are those who say they know what God thinks. That he knows what's right for you, what holy days you should and should not attend, what foods you may and may not eat, what sexual practices you may or may not partake in. These people must be wrong, because saying you know what God thinks, what he wants, that's unprovable, that's unverifiable. It's a ridiculous claim to make, and again, anybody who says that has all their work still ahead of them. When people say, God doesn't want you to be homosexual, what they're really doing is quoting Leviticus or the Old Testament, because that's where the scriptural basis for that assertion comes from. Now, I just want to put this in perspective for you. To think that the people who wrote the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and even more specifically Leviticus, we're talking about Bronze Age Palestinian scribes with a pre-scientific understanding of the world, to think that these people have any more moral authority than rational, scientific, and logical people living in the 21st century, this claim is ridiculous. What would give these scribes such power, such moral authority? Since their claim to divine inspiration can really be attributed to nothing more than a sort of optimistic theological speculation, and since that claim is in no way justifiable or verifiable, anybody who's using the Old Testament or Leviticus to justify the condemnation of homosexuality is really doing nothing more than citing the opinions of the ruling priestly class of the ancient Judean desert as their own opinions. As a final note on arguments against homosexuality from religion, if you will argue about sex from a religious standpoint, you should first acknowledge monotheism's visceral fear of sex and repression of it whenever it crops up. If you will argue that sex outside of marriage or without openness to conception is immoral, then I will argue that you are afraid of having sex for pleasure, and therefore have no business telling other people who do not share your aversion for their own genitalia and libido what is and is not permissible to do in the bedroom. If you've heard any other coherent arguments against homosexuality that I might have missed, please feel free to tell me about them. If there's anybody who's just, just face palming, saying, oh my god, this kid just doesn't get how raunchy homosexuality is, you know what? Tell me about it. Tell me why I'm wrong, because guess what? I'm going to kick your ass.